Greetings and salutations, and welcome to Radio Dayz, a podcast radio program that delves into the world of terrestrial radio. It's DJs and on-air personality, and you, all fans of the radio as a medium. Here is your host, Ron Robinson.
Hello and welcome to Radio Dayz The Screamcast, episode 1 of season 3. How have you been? We are not only going to offer the audio podcast for your enjoyment this season, but now you can watch this show via streamcasting on YouTube and, of course, at ronrobinsonstudios.com. This week, we're going to sit down with a very decorated Detroit radio personality and a former PA announcer for the Detroit Pistons. You may know him as the Casual One. This week on Radio Dayz The Screamcast, I'm going to welcome the legendary Mr. Ken Calvert. We're also going to be joined by a special guest or two, but first, today's episode is brought to you by NRM Screamcast, also by Radio Dayz, the docu-series, and I'm very excited to introduce here in a second our latest sponsor to this program, the Linda Rea Team Real Estate Professionals. This first segment, in fact, is sponsored by the Linda Rea Team. And to tell us more about the Linda Rea Team, here is Linda herself. Linda, how are you today?
Hey, I'm wonderful. It's 2023 coming up, huh?
Yeah, I can't believe it's 2023. So what does 2023? Tell us a little bit about your Linda Rea Professional Real Estate Team.
Well, our team is, we've never been more prepared and motivated to attract closings for both buyers and sellers, and to also educate the public on the economic shift, make sure that they don't leave any money on the table.
Yes, no. So if someone is in the market to either buy or sell, how do they go about utilizing your expertise?
Well, just call and schedule a private consultation with us, and we will have a lot of information for you, and also answers for things that I'm sure that you have questions to regarding the sales of homes in 2023.
And of course, you can find the Linda Rea information right there on the screen there. So, Linda, here's to a prosperous 2023, and thank you for being a sponsor of this program. We appreciate you.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody have a blessed day.
So before I welcome my guests today, I'd like to remind you that if you'd like to hear previous episodes of Radio Dayz, the podcast, you can do so by logging on to ronrobinsonstudios.com. So without further ado, here is part 1 of my interview with the Casual One, Mr. Ken Calvert. Enjoy. My guest today has been heard on W4, WABX, WLLZ, and WRIF. And from 86 to 2002, he was the PA announcer at the Palace of the Auburn Hills for the Detroit Pistons. Did I mention, this is my favorite thing about you, Ken, is that you are a graduate of Brother Rice High School.
Yeah, hail our warriors, hats off to thee. To our colors true we will ever be. Orange and black united we stand, working ever failing, never pulling for our team together. Warriors, we think you're grand.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ken Calvert, how are you, sir?
I'm fine. This is awesome. I'm looking across at a couple of really old and great friends. Just incredible.
And I want to give them an introduction. So, but before we go any further, I want to bring in and introduce another luminary in Detroit radio and former coworker of Ken's, Buzz Van Houten. And if you work in the industry, you know that name. If you're an avid radio fan, you might not know Buzz's name, but he's worked in sales and he's worked in management for just about, I don't know, every radio station here in Detroit. You guys work together, I think, at Wheels,
WRIF,
and W4,
and W4. That was
WJR.
And WJR. We're going to talk about that too, because that's something you don't talk a lot about, Ken. But I wanted to bring in Buzz because, you know, this show is about personalities in their career, and you guys go way back. I mean, you guys go way back to the beginning, before Ken Calvert was Ken Calvert. I mean, could you talk about when you guys were coming up together?
Well, I don't want to. It sort of involves Don Schuster.
Okay,
yeah, it definitely involves.
All right, well,
I hate to.
I'll bring in. Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I hate to do that
to you, but I can't really start the platform that we built without Don Schuster.
Right. Fair enough. So with that in mind, we're going to bring the talented, I keep wanting to call him Mr. Ripley because he looks younger every time I talk to him. But Ken, you worked with this man, Donald Schuster, in the W4 days. And if you don't recognize that name, Donald Schuster's been around, I don't know, for a long time. What was your first job in radio, Don?
My first job in radio is when I'm 16 years old, and I get a job at WKNR Keener 13 to answer the request lines 6 p.m. to midnight for $1.60 an hour.
Who was working? Who was doing the shift?
Well, there was Ed Bush at the time.
Yeah.
And a guy named Sean Conrad was doing afternoons. And I think a guy that went on to be named Bob Dearborn was doing evenings. I forget what name he was using on Keener at the time.
Yeah, he said Sean Sebastian, right? Was that the...
Sean Conrad was doing
Sean Conrad. And he actually pioneered WKNR FM, or was one of the real... He was part of the core that took WKNR and really went toe-to-toe with WABX and WRIF FM. So I'm sorry.
And Jerry Goodwin goes from the AM.
Yeah,
Jerry Goodwin goes from the AM to the FM. So he goes from with a really yucky sound in his voice saying, "Sweetie baby, chicky pussycat" on the AM. It sounds drugged out, whatever on the FM.
It was important for me to bring in Don because doing research for my interview with you, Ken, which I took very seriously because Ken Calvert, to me, is one of the best persons that ever conducted any interviews. I mean, JP gets a lot of respect, Larry King, but Ken Calvert, to me, is the epitome of someone who you would want to interview somebody. And so with that in mind, I did my homework, and I listened to the podcast that you did with Mike's staff, and you told the story about how you came to get hired at W4, how Donald Schuster here hired you. Could you tell that story a little bit?
Yeah, I'll make it really, really as quick as I can. I was desperate. I always wanted to be. I was one of those guys, and we've read about it so many times from, all of the consultants will talk about things in a broadcaster's life. The record ending, and you cannot find the album you're looking for, even though there are 10,000 albums to pick from. You want that one song, and you keep looking back at the turntable, and the record is ending, and your time is getting shorter and shorter, and you wake up and you go, you just absolutely go insane. The other story that every really good broadcaster will tell you is exactly what I did. I would lay in bed at night as a young kid, and I had a small transistor radio with an alligator clip, and you would just simply click it to anything metal. And you would get, especially at night when the 50,000 clear watt radio stations would just get on a train and run. And I remember listening to WLS, CFL.
Ernie's Record Mart from Memphis, Tennessee.
Yeah, and Pittsburgh and WDVE, I believe it was. And I just remember going, wow, I get the chills thinking about it right now. Wow, I got to do this. I got to do this. And that's when I moved sideways to Keener 13, and that's when Lee Allen was Lee Allen on the horn. And I just fell in love with these guys, make it or break it, and I begged my parents for a phone so I could call Keener 13. 4 seasons, Sherry Baby.
So the other names you remember, Ken, would be Scott Regan, J. Michael Wilson.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I'm hitting the era. That was 1965-66.
And they were great jocks who were managing to do all of this production in such a short period of time. In 3 minutes, they could create a production piece. I remember there was a guy by the name of J. Michael Wilson or something like that, and he had a character called Rodney the Wonder Rodent. And he would take tape, and he would go from 7.5 to 15 and make it turn into a mouse-sounding little thing. And the character was always getting in his way in the studio, and it was just, it was wonderful stuff. So that's basically how I got my interest in radio came from that, and that's all I wanted to do. I pursued it. Went to Aquinas College. I tried out for the radio station there. The general manager of the radio station said to me, quote, "Do the industry a favor and never get into it." That was enough for me to say, okay, now you lit more than an M80 up my butt, and now I'm doing this thing. Went to OCC, WORB, had to give me a gig because I took 12 hours. They partnered me with this woman by the name of Randy Stember. And Randy Stember was I'm going to simply say, she was beautiful. She was absolutely gorgeous, had a great voice, still has a great voice. Randy Thomas, she took that radio name, got herself a job at W4. And she kept telling the people at W4, there's this guy, Ken Calvert, you really should kind of, take a look at, take a listen to. I believe, Don, I believe it was Randy that got me the interview with you.
Yes, that is very close to how I remember it. I actually remember, first of all, there was a vacuum created at W4 because a couple of the management people and a couple of the on-air people all went as a group to Dallas to start KZEW.
That's right.
I remember, yeah, Mark Addy was one of them. And who was the guy from...
Michael Benner.
Ken Rundle.
Ken Rundle.
Michael Benner stays here.
Yeah, Benner stayed.
Yeah, Benner, that's right, he did.
But I'm trying to think of the guy from Ira J. Wilson.
Yes, Ira J. Cook.
Ira J. Cook.
Yeah.
Ira J. Cook was the program director at KZEW, wasn't he? And didn't he sort of...
Yes.
He just...
And John New was the general manager.
Yes, and he rated W4 for its talent, leaving...
Well, he took W4's talent with him, yeah. Well, good for him. He was that great of a manager that people would want to stick with him. But it did create a vacuum in Detroit, for which I became the program director.
Yep.
And
at 18 years old.
On-air people. I was 21. Oh. I was 21. Yep. You are right about it being young.
Yes.
Can I highly recommend it? Well, okay, go ahead.
I walk into the production studio one day as I'm in need of on-air talent because this vacuum has been created. And Randy is listening to a tape of yours. And the way I recall it is I say to Randy, "Who is that?" He is exactly who I'm looking for. You reminded me of Paul Greiner on WABX. And that certainly helped because that was the general sound I was looking for. And that puts the two of us in touch, and we go from there and even solidify our upcoming relationship even further in the sunshine, as you might want to tell.
On Belle Isle. I remember I was at the time a house painter with a very good and now very successful friend of mine, Peter Leonard, who's an author, the son of the Dickens of Detroit, Elmore Leonard, and we were painting houses, and we were going by the name of Turpentine. I was Bud Turp, and he was Rick Tyne, and a true story. And so I got this phone call, or somehow I don't know exactly how it came down, but it must have been a phone call from Randy telling me to call you. I think that's how it happened.
Something like that, yeah.
I called you, and you said, "Sure, come on down. Let me buy you lunch," or something like that. Got down to W4. I don't know if I think we got in my car. We stopped at a small little carryout place for chicken.
KFC?
I don't know exactly, but I remember you left.
It's amazing how we recreate the details. You know what? Because we're both on the same page with these stories. I had you stocking at Great Scott all night instead of painting, and when I tell the story.
No, and I was working at the grocery store as well.
Didn't you work with Chuck Santoni?
I worked with Chuck Santoni, yeah, and I also worked with Jim Scollin, who ended up going to Northern Michigan and has been had been a Northern Michigan pioneer in terms of broadcasting. He's still broadcasting, still doing it. But the point I was going to make, Don, was that you pulled into the parking lot of this chicken shack or whatever it was, and it was not the best part of Detroit. We've got to be honest about that. The building
bordering Belle Isle.
And you said, "Stay right here. I'm going to go in and get some chicken." And I went, "Okay." And I was driving, as a matter of fact. I remember that now, and I was just like, "Okay, done. Let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go." We ended up getting a bucket of chicken and some sides of something. I know you brought a side with you as we went over to Belle Isle, and if I'm not mistaken, I was smoking at the time. I don't know if you were. What I'm getting at is we smoked a big fatty. We smoked a big...
I had forgotten that, and the reason I've forgotten that, it was so normal at that time. There was nothing that stood out about it.
Yeah. Well, I remember, and all we did, we sat outside having food, talking exactly the way we're talking now, almost 50 years later. I mean, if you think about it.
49 years.
Yeah. Has it been? Yes, it has. Okay. Yes.
70, yep.
Yeah.
49.
Yeah. So I'll tell this side, and then you tell your side. We had a marvelous time. We shared interests that were like so similar, it was scary. I mean, it was unbelievable. I was at the grocery store. I was house painting. I was at OCC, and I remember the way I remember it. You told me, you got a hell of a future in this business. It's just not here right now. It would be almost irresponsible for me to take and put forth you in front of the general manager because you've only got a little college behind you. And I said, it doesn't matter, man. I did it. I accomplished it. I got an interview at a major market radio station, and you didn't just dust me off. We had lunch. You listened. I listened. We had a great time. And then somehow within the next couple of days, maybe even the same day, you called me to say, hey, my all-night guy is always screwing up and screwing me. Is there any way you can come down and do the all-night show for me? And it was, I will name the guy, was Brent Wilson. Do you remember Brent Wilson?
Oh, absolutely, I do.
Is that, am I
Although
correct?
I'm going to deny saying he screwed me up. I would absolutely agree that I called you to do the all-night show. I'm going to deny that I ever said Brent was screwing me up.
Well, I didn't mean to, I throw around words loosely, like screw up meaning called in sick or something like that.
Or fall asleep.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
I know that
well,
you've
he'll
seen that
deny
happen.
no matter what. Such a man of class, he always was.
I know.
Until you get him on
But
the
I'm going
island.
to take
with-
the order. I'm going to take the story from there for a moment because that is absolutely true.
Yep.
That I call Ken and say, why don't we do an on-air audition? We'll do it on the all-night show, virtually nobody's listening. And certainly relatively nobody was listening. And let's just do a dry run there. And I, to this day, 49 years later, regret not recording that all-night show because you were totally free form, because I didn't tell you to do anything. I said, let's just keep the station on the air and let's do something for 6 hours. And you just ran free form, not even knowing the rules. And it was one of the most marvelous 6 hours I've ever heard on radio. Do you agree with that, Buzz?
I do. Can I interject something here? Because the next morning when you came in, I stayed up that night and listened to his show. And I agree with you that he really resembled, in his approach to everything, Paul Greiner. And the next morning when I saw you, the first thing I said to you was, Don, you got to hire this guy. I mean, and I had to go tell, I think it was Bart Walsh was our general manager at the time. And I went into him and said the same thing. And he's looking at me like, you're a sales guy. What do you know? Well, I know good radio and I know good presentation when I hear it. That's what I know.
Was it just
Right.
his pipes, or was it because of the way
No,
you
it
went
was
about
the
his
show.
show?
No.
He
It
was the
his whole
casual one
personality.
from day one.
Let me even give you an example that happened off air, and it'll at least point to the quirkiness he brought to on air that night. This is off air now. One time Ken comes in, and off the air he's doing a bit about how he's got hemorrhoids. And he went to the doctor, and the doctor told him it's because he's been being nervous and tense while in a seated position. And that premise became the running underlying note of an ongoing joke he ran for the entire day. And it was some of the most marvelous humor I've ever heard extended in my life. Now, he didn't do hemorrhoid humor on the air, but he ran loose and wild like that all night long, and it was phenomenal.
I remember that. I remember you coming in after 1 hour. You basically left me alone in that studio, and you had work to do in your office across the hall. And you would kind of come in and just give me the thumbs up, like, keep it going. In other words, just keep us on the air. That was my mission. That was indeed my mission. And I remember barely being able to put the needle, and queuing it up. And I was just like the pots were the size of my hat, those big twist and turn dudes. But so anyway, I remember earlier in the day you telling me, don't go back to bed, don't take a nap, put on a pot of coffee right now, get down here early, I'll do some coaching. And I think that I almost collapsed at about 6 a.m., but we got through it.
Probably did.
Yeah.
You sure did.
But
Well, it's interesting to hear their perspective of what they thought of you, Ken. But from your perspective, I mean, were you just happy for the opportunity? What was going on in your head?
100%. 100%. I could officially say and tell my friends and the teachers that did believe in me in high school, very few, a limited bundle that was, that I did it. That I actually did it on a major market radio station. And, of course, I never thought to tape it either. Maybe Art Volo did.
It's possible.
Yeah.
Have you been to his catalog? It's it's amazing how many people he has air checks from.
Well, yeah, it was always funny because Art would tape everybody, and then he would take our shows, and if somebody would say, "What is this Ken Calvert sound like? He'd go, well, I'll send you an air check of them, and he'd say, but it's going to cost you $100. It was great. It was great to know that he was running a cottage industry off of recording all of us
as radio's best friend.
I do want to ask a question here, because especially people in radio now, they all come from the digital age. And in my movie, I do a segment of the rock wars that were going on in those early days. But what I really like to know about, and if you could walk us through, Ken, because nowadays, if you go on the air, say like Meltdown at RIF or anybody of the kind, they have a system that's all digital, it's all computerized. But when you walked into the studio back at W4 and even the ABX days, you worked your butt off for 4 hours, didn't you? I mean, talk to me, what was that like to do a show? Because it wasn't just about turning records, was it?
No. And the other thing is, I was just going to follow up with what Buzzy was saying. I remember getting off the air. And I do remember even me sort of saying to myself, because of the pacing that we were doing back in the 70s, it was much more of a, hey, WWWW. Great to be with you. Got a really tasty track coming up. Going to do some Uriah Heep for you. No, not the one you're thinking about. But everybody was sort of in that lower. I remember Karen Savelli really, when you hear an air check of Karen,
she was silky.
She loved to use the word tasty. And I was like, okay, all right. And then, but there was really no show prep, but I remember that we did everything according to, at that time, it was Don Schuster. We had a box. We had songs in the box. We sort of played with the format, but the whole format at the time was totally different. And I don't know if that's getting back to your question or not. But it was, we just sort of got there early because we wanted to be, that was really a clubhouse.
Yeah,
that was a place to hang out. If it would have had like a bunk, literally a bunk house, a lot of people would stay there and should have stayed there because of what we would do around the area.
I often refer to it as the University of Radio, because it was a time when most of the people that worked there, myself included, was our first radio jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, really, in a major market. And
it was WKRP in many ways.
Many ways. Oh, my God, yes. And, from the point where the general manager would tell you to go out, if you were sitting at your desk, he'd say, listen, there's potholes in the parking lot, go out and fill them.
Yeah. I remember cutting
Ron,
the lawn.
Can I address on some level the comparison between
the
the digitally programmed era of now and the freer form era of then, although it was formatted? The case you could make for the way it's programmed now is that it lends for more consistency, because as much as there was formatting back then, and Ken was following a format when he went in there, and Karen was following the same format, it still allowed for the individual jock's personal taste to come through, because you had to select a song from category A next. It's programmed to that extent. You were limited from the category from which you're going to pick, but there were a lot of variances within that category, so that there's a consistency today that you could make a case for is good.
You could do Uriah Heep into a Traffic song, whereas Karen may have done Uriah Heep into a Rolling Stones song, which would have been
and I'll give you a specific example that
categorically in the same boxes, but different artists. Does that make sense?
So Ken eventually gets the 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. slot on W4. That's a big time slot. This was 1970s. This was basically young men, 18 to 34, listening. That was when they tuned in the radio. That was rock and roll nighttime in Detroit. Talk about personal taste slipping in. So a few days into his show, at 6 o'clock, Ken takes over. First song of the show at 6 o'clock, Detroit, Rock City. These people have been hammering out at Ford Motor Company all day on the line. And Ken starts out with Hot Rod Lincoln by Commander Cody and the Lost Planet Airmen.
I love that song.
Gotta get myself hot. It's a combination between 1950 and a novelty song.
Right.
And I pull Ken into my office the next day. Ken, you're doing a good job overall. You really, really are. Ken, I'm looking for a little more of a driving Detroit sound to kick off that show to set the tone. I want to play for you Rolling Down the Highway by Bachman Turner Overdrive. This is a little bit more of the sound I'm looking for. And he adapted.
Yeah, because you did it correctly. You didn't sort of push me in the direction. You steered me in the direction. You didn't grab the wheel. So many PDs, and we could do a whole. I mean, there's your next series. Just talk to program directors and ask them about their management styles. But your management style was one of the very. I was terrified when you left, and I was crushed when you left because of both how much I enjoyed our time together and how you sort of really directed us in such cool and positive directions without us even knowing it. And that was cool. Then others came in who were not so cool. And I was totally, I did not play as nice. But don't forget as well that part of that job, Ron, as well, was to work in concert with the sales department. And that's where the WKRP portion of it came in, because Buzzy I remember you guys were all on the first floor looking out the window, 2930 East Jefferson, and there were like 2 desks or 3 across.
There was 2, and McNally was in one. I was in another one. Gary Lewis and the blonde lady. I'm trying to remember her name. That McNally would
occasionally have to do late nights with.
Yes.
Yeah. And who was? I'll never forget Bart Walsh. When Bart Walsh hired me, by the way, for 6 to 10 at night, called me in and made him. He tried to make me feel like this was killing him. He didn't want to do this. Sit down. You like it here? Oh, I'm in heaven. I've never been. This is the happiest place I've ever been. Good. All right, here's what we're going to do. I got stuff to do. I'm going to pay you, I wrote it down here somewhere. All right, I'm going to pay you $750 a month, 6 days a week. I want you doing 6 to 10. Don wrote it down for me. I want you doing 6 to 10 at night, and then I want you doing 10 to 2 on Saturdays. And McNally did 6 to 10 in the morning.
Right.
And a sales guy did a morning show. And Roger Middleton was another one that had a part. And these guys went on to be big stars in radio.
But only Pat McNally used classic phrases like the clock on the wall says it's 8:12.
Yes. I remember. That's funny, see, because this is what we do. I remember when Paul Sullivan was our PD, and I used to say, or I did say, the temperature stands at 77 degrees right now in the Rockin' Motor City. And he came blasting through the door. And he's like, the temperature stands? Does the temperature walk? And it was like, I remember he walked over to there was an ashtray, and he tipped it over, and I was like, all right, push it back a little bit, bro. Push it back a little bit.
Oh, boy.
But I remember that the temperature stands. Does the temperature walk? Little nuggets that I'll never, ever forget. But what I was going to say is that I remember Buzzy came into the studio one time and said, I need your help. I got an auto parts guy going on the air, and I forget what the name of it was now, but I wrote a jingle. Edelbrock Manifolds made for you. And you did the baritone part of it.
Amen.
And I remember the client absolutely loved it. But just to add real quickly to anything that I sort of tend to go off on, Don was special. Don was the greatest. Don was, like I said, the director of all things good. If I could take one space in time and go back and just stay there, I would take that time. I remember as well, I actually painted because of the fact that in order for me to get a loan for my car from Bart Walsh, he said, I'll loan you the money, but you have to paint the radio station.
Oh, yeah, you were painting the studio.
I was painting the inside of that radio station for at least 2.5 months.
Yep.
It was brutal. It was one of the worst things ever. And the other thing was Chris Failer and that famous sign out in front. It was like a movie theater sign.
Yep.
And we took a great photo. I hope you've seen it, or I hope you have it. Do you have it, Don? The photo of us of all standing up on that billboard on 29th.
Oh, I can picture it, but no, I don't think I have it personally.
I will send it to you. It's Benner, Jim Jefferson, who's passed away, I just found out.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, Michael Benner, Jim Jefferson, Karen Savelli, Ken Calvert, and Brent Wilson. And am I missing anybody? No. I guess just there were 5 of us. And we were looking like, we looked like it looked like the back of Journey's first album. It was like, we were some, but that's, like I said, if we would have had a bunkhouse, I would have lived there.
Well, and we all had a responsibility to change the letters on the sign at one point or another.
Or cut the lawn.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Chris Failer would tell us.
Buzz, here's something I remember, Buzz, next to your sales desk down on that first floor that Ken described, you had a picture of a hammock in the sunshine looking like it was on the beach in Hawaii or whatever like that.
Yeah, that's where I
How
came
that
from.
That was your ultimate goal. That was where you came from?
Yeah, when I got out of the service, I stayed in Hawaii for another 3 years.
okay.
And that's where you were going back to.
Yeah, I was going to go back to
That's-
that come hell or high water.
Did you ever make it back?
Oh, yeah, but, just on vacations and honeymoons.
Yeah.
And one honeymoon.
Yeah.
Donald, I
The
appreciate
good
you coming.
honeymoon or the bad honeymoon? I mean, it was a good honeymoon.
It was a good honeymoon,
But
yeah.
was it the keeper or the sleeper?
It's the trace.
All right, okay.
Donald, I appreciate you coming on. Anything you want to add before we let you go?
Nope. It's just a pleasure to be remembered and associated with the group 49 years later, Ken.
Who hired? Did you hire Randy Thomas?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
She's
Yes.
gone
Now
on
is
to be
doing
well.
announcing on
She-
the. Yeah,
I
she
want
went
you to-
to Florida.
She's. I just happened to see something. She's making at least $3 million a year doing VOs. Entertainment Tonight was always her, but she also did the Tonys, the Academy Awards,
And
the
the Emmys.
Emmys, and guess what else she just did?
What?
The hearings on Monday night.
Really?
The Voice leading in, and ladies and gentlemen, live from Washington D.C.
Wow.
On one network or on the entire feed?
Because I thought it was one feed for all of them.
I think it was
Yeah,
one
it
feed.
was one feed for everybody.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So she had a good day.
And
She is that good. She
is.
is that good.
And she's an extremely wonderful individual.
She's incredible.
I mean, I worked with her, it was 40-some years ago when we worked together at W4, and I got a thing when my son passed away. I got a thing from her telling me how sorry she was to hear it. So she stayed in touch with everybody.
That's sweet.
And I
yeah.
might add, Don, that anybody who has ever worked with you, from the people at W4 to my good friend Bob Schick or any of the people at WWJ, you are an iconic individual who everybody says marvelous things about. You should be very proud of your career and yourself at this point in life.
You know what? Yeah, go ahead. I wanted to say 100% echo what you're saying there.
Thank you. I had lunch with you at, what was the restaurant, the burger place right by Tiger Stadium down there?
Was it Nemo's?
Nemo's, yeah.
Buzz and I have lunch at Nemo's 1975, I'm going to say. And Buzz tells me good things come to all that wait. So I'm glad I waited to get that nod from you in 2022.
Oh, my
Thank
goodness.
you.
That's
well,
awesome.
you're an incredible man. I'll tell you what. You remind me so much of another friend of mine who is also in the business and now retired, Michael Mayer.
Oh, yeah.
Michael Mayer is just another guy who's just kept
The midnight cab driver.
Yeah. Just
You know what? And thanks to my friends at WJR, I'm still doing 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. on Sunday mornings on WJR. I'm the second voice to Joe Gannon, the appliance doctor. And
I'm Joe
two of us
Gannon.
do
Here's
Sunday
what I
mornings,
want you
6
to
a.m. to 8
do.
a.m.
Go around to the back of that dryer. You're
Yeah.
going to see six what look to be like little crosses that you'd see in a rosary.
And here's where we come full circle, Ken, because that was my very first job in radio was answering phones for Joe Gannon, the appliance doctor at JR back in 2000.
He was a phone lighter, man.
Oh, man.
Oh,
He
God,
was a
yes.
phone lighter. Yeah, so.
Donald, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
We appreciate you.
Ron,
Don,
Ken, Buzz.
I encourage everyone that is listening to the podcast right now to go to YouTube just to get a better visual of Don Schuster and check out Don Schuster on the air at W4 wearing a shirt and a tie and watch him slam it and jam it like nobody ever has before. He's literally dancing and just doing a radio show.
It's
popping-
1970, 6 months out of high school. My older brother is 4 years older than me. Gets a new Bell & Howell Soundo Filmo camera for Christmas for himself, and it was the first time you could take an 8mm film but hook it with a little wire to a cassette machine and it would sync sound. So he tapes me, and Art Volo says that might be the oldest radio air check of the modern age out there because it wasn't even videotape to begin with. It was truly 8mm.
For that reason alone, what's the title when people go to search
Don
on you?
Schuster, 1970.
And Schuster, spell
Don
Schuster.
Schuster, 19. S-C-H-U-S.
S-C-H-U-S-T-E-R.
Right.
Okay. So I wanted to get that in because I can look at that all
Thank you,
day.
Ken.
If I'm ever in a bad mood, I look at that and I go, no. That's what we do, Ken. We love radio. Thanks, Don Schuster.
Good to see you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
Buzz.
Don.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks, Ken.
See, he lives in Ann Arbor now. He gets to just go do. He's going to probably Well, who knows what they do?
Yeah, he's got a lot to do in Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
This segment is brought to you by Radio Dayz, 101 Years of Radio, documentary about the history of radio. Find out which station was the first licensed station. Was it WWJ or KDKA? The first superstar celebrity created by radio was a priest from Detroit. I think you knew that.
Yeah, it would be. Father Coughlin. Went by the shrine today. Those towers, those sound towers are still up there.
Yes, they are.
It's the radio history. I also talk about the genesis of Top 40 and FM, and as of course, you can find out more about this when it's slated for release in the next couple of months. Go to ronrobinsonstudios.com. Hear the stories from those who lived it, and someone who lived it is my guest today, Ken Calvert. Thanks again for joining me today. And I want to talk. We talked a little bit about your W4 days, and we're going to keep Buzz on here for a little bit, but. When and why did you leave W4 to move over to ABX? Talk about that transition.
I don't know if it was the smartest move I ever made, but it was one I had to make.
Oh, absolutely.
I had to make. I mean, WABX was so iconic, at least in my head and my mind, that I just had to. That original team, their original team. And so many claim to be air aces. Even I don't claim to be an air ace. An air ace was Dan Carlisle, and it would have been as well
Jerry Lubin.
It would have been Paul Greiner. It would have also been, Dave Dixon.
Oh, God,
the great Dave Dixon. So he said Dixon, Carlisle, Lubin, and I'm trying to think of Dennis Frawley. And the Righteous Rudnick.
The Righteous Rudnick.
Those were the air aces. They were the guys.
Now, why were they air aces?
They named themselves.
It's because what they did.
They were smart enough then to realize what the history looked like. They also wanted their time to stand still, and people that. You got to realize, Ron, this is something that is going to be in a history book. Now, it's not going to be something that people are saying, I remember. No, the only way they're going to remember is if they go somewhere and listen to an audio file.
Or if they go on the Facebook ABX page.
But it's people contributing who are members of a legion and not the people that really lived it and put it out there. And I have no qualms with that. I have no qualms with that at all. I do something every day on Twitter and Facebook. The Ken Calvert Show on Facebook. It's a separate page from my Ken Calvert. Mm-hmm. And every day I put up at least 3 or 4 things that happened on this date in rock and roll. And I investigated 5 different ways to Sunday to make sure that I'm right.
Right.
And I've discovered so many sites historically are incorrect. I mean, they really get it wrong. They get the year wrong. They get the actual date wrong. But there's a lot of, for example, yesterday was recorded on this date back in 1965 or 66. I should know because I posted it. But before I would do that, I wanted to make sure, because it was recorded, the rest of the Beatles wanted nothing to do with the song yesterday. But I had to dig deep to get just how even then these guys were not getting along. And Paul McCartney wrote the song and they went, that's not us, and so on and so forth. So those are pages I have a great base and a lot of people following it, but I also have a lot of radio stations following it because I'm doing their show prep for them every day with Facebook and Twitter. So if you need a really great source, folks, because I don't get a dime out of this, but a love, because I just love I was living it. I was
That's a whole industry as a morning show service. You could make a living off of that.
Well, I prefer to do a morning show somewhere. But anyway, I'm sort of like, again, my mind just goes
go ahead.
all
the
over the
floor
place.
is yours, yeah.
But I mean, ABX was a place that I just had to work at, and I knew I was going to take shit. And pardon my language, but I knew that at the time. It was John. I'm trying to think of who the general manager was before Al Wilson.
John Detz?
John Detz, thank you. John Detz, who really was sort of a disinterested guy in me, but they did need some help. They were starting to transcend into real lives. Like, in other words, we don't sleep here anymore. We actually want vacations, and stuff. I'm talking about the staff. Mm-hmm. So they needed somebody that sort of sounded like the ABX guys sounded. And per their approval, I guess, because I never knew for sure, but it couldn't have happened without, the real Air Aces approval.
Bringing you aboard,
they brought me aboard.
Now,
And,
what was? Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, what was the dynamic like? Because there was a PD there, but did the jocks kind of did they have a lot of freedom? No, there was no PD. That's right. PD.
You played anything you wanted, and I'm talking about spoken word. There's a guy that used to do the Levi commercials years ago and was just lived all things. He was one of the greatest voices out there. He was like Paul LaFontaine with the movies. Who did the Levi spots, and his name was Ken Nordine. Yep. And I remember Ken Nordine had a section in the WABX library that was spoken word, and he would just, and it was almost like a coffee shop, It was like people snapping their fingers to Ken Nordine. So you could play anything you wanted. The Last Poets, I love The Last Poets, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. Yeah. I love the fact that people think that just came out 2 years ago. No, that's been around for 45 years, and Whitey on the Moon. Mm-hmm. The Revolution will not be televised because Whitey is on the moon. and that's another one. These people should go and look up The Last Poets. You would the early cadence of rap. Mm-hmm. Truly the early cadence of rap. Anyway, ABX was a vault of music. There was albums everywhere, all 3.5 walls. They had curtains in the studio, but nobody really liked to open the curtains. They liked a really sort of what we have in this studio right now, and these lights would be much lower, by the way. They smoked weed in the studio. I remember, I'm not going to identify the jock per se, but he drank a 6-pack a day of Heineken while on the air in the studio.
Wow.
Yeah, and did middays, and you would never know.
No.
Never know. But it was something that I had the offer, and I forget who. I think Detz may have actually kind of gone underground with me somehow, some way, and I'm trying to think of. We had a couple of parties that crossed over, and I remember one time we went out to a farmhouse, and W4 sort of cross-pollinated with ABX, and people got along. And I'll remember Cindy Phelong was the first female I ever worked alongside. Cindy Phelong was doing the news at WABX, and they did legitimate news, like it was an NPR-type format. I mean, she did a half an hour at 12 noon.
Wow.
It's sort of,
Yeah, that's unheard
it was
of
very
now.
serious. Very serious, and she had interns. I had no idea she had runners, getting literally stuff from
quite the production,
city council, and all that. Yeah.
And the news of the day back then too was a lot more. It was more dire because of Vietnam, because of the stuff going on, the racial situations here in Detroit.
Not to mention what CKLW was doing with the 2020 news too, right?
Yes.
You remember?
Yeah.
Speaking of that, when we had the mayor called all the radio station people together to try and to banish the Murder City thing, where Byron McGregor used to come out and say, "Today, stock market plunges, murder rate soars."
Yeah,
Byron McGregor, 2020 News.
Young Bob Benson wanted to be a big league ball player. Well, he got his chance today. He took that baseball bat and he teed off on younger brother Bobby's head. Well, the gumshoes came and got him, and he's playing ball now in the Crowbar Motel.
He made Detroit sound like Gotham City.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And he
came to work for us at Wheels.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And he came to work fresh every day, too. He'd wear a beautiful suit and tie, and just an incredible, incredible man. ABX was something I really don't remember of. You got to decide, do you want the job or don't you? I remember sitting on the fence for a 2 or 3 week period, and Detz finally called me and said, "Look, we got to move on here. Do you want it or don't you?" And I remember at the time the PD, I don't know, it wasn't Don Schuster, but I think it may. Whoever followed Schuster. I don't know if it was Paul.
I think it might have been Sullivan.
It might have been Paul Sullivan. But no, it was Paul Sullivan.
Yeah.
It was Paul Sullivan. And Paul Sullivan I just went to him, and he didn't care because he was moving on anyway.
He was going to Seattle.
Yep. Yeah, he was moving on anyway. So long story short, I ended up going to WABX, and I really enjoyed my time at WABX. I did and I didn't. I loved the early stages, but I was terrified, and Carlisle was a decent enough guy to me. Dixon really had nothing to do with me. Dixon never, ever really had much to do with me. I actually became good friends. Of course, I just forgot his name, with Dennis Frawley, who lived very close to me at the time. I remember Frawley telling me, remember, we don't talk about sports on ABX, but we can talk about sports when the mics are off. Because he was a huge Tigers fan, and a big Lions fan as well. And I remember we played baseball in a music league, and he was like the only guy that would show up. But he played well. He was a really good player. But anyway, there were restrictions that the air aces would put on me as a guy that would fill in. When I would fill in, they would like lock their own music up. They would literally, you can't touch this.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and but I took the gig, and that's when things really got interesting in my career. That was like a whole.
Did you get a lot of attention?
Did I get a lot of what?
Attention from other stations at that time?
At that time, they were pissed off at W4, so I was like kind of, you go to a concert, and it's like, oh, how you doing? You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden it was like, hey, how do I get over there? Mm-hmm. All of a sudden things were getting tighter and tighter formatically at W4. And the tighter and tighter the format got at W4, the more and more people wanted to go to WABX.
True, that is.
And that was at the same time that WRIF FM was starting to really format, and they were starting to move on from Brother John Rygren, who just went by the name of Brother John. And I think that they also had Penhollow. Penhollow was their show pony. They brought in Cicero Grimes.
Yeah, speaking of Ann Arbor, I think it was Ann Arbor, right?
Yeah, outside of Ann Arbor. Yeah, I want to say he lived in Chelsea or something like that.
The great Dick Kernan, I think, discovered it.
Yeah, well, what a presence he had.
Oh my God!
Yeah, it remains that to this day. But anyway, I just know that more and more people were starting to get along in terms of radio, kind of actually piling up on WRIF.
Yeah,
the one thing we will never be is a formatted radio FM station like that WRIF. Although WRIF, the program directors would say, look at these numbers. We are getting killed. And you know why? It's because they have a format. And I remember they would kind of play everything. I remember they would play like Livin' for the City by Stevie Wonder. Mm-hmm. And we kind of thought, well, so are all the top 40s. If it's on top 40, we don't play it.
We don't want to play it.
We don't want to play it.
And W4 at the time, too, was between what RIF was and what ABX was. We touched on both sides because Walsh he was the general manager that came from CKLW, and he was a broadcaster.
Yeah.
And he was going to teach all of us the business of broadcast.
Yeah.
Well, he did.
Yeah. And they brought in the little boxes, the file boxes we had Wowies and Whoppers and A, B, C, and D's. And we were allowed one Wowie a night, and you could only play the Wowie once every 6 days, but you had to put your initials. So there was a lot of different formatting was beginning everywhere. RIF was the tightest. You couldn't get any tighter for an FM radio station. They were probably playing literally 300 songs, which was, by our standards, absurd. I could play 300 songs in a week. They were starting to play... And this is where they really stepped in a bucket of pucky, if you will. They were actually starting to not play the long songs. I mean, they were starting to go for more music in the hour and all that sort of stuff. And they were dealing with ABC News at the top of the hour before ABC News. Anyway, I'm straying all over them, remembering this stuff.
Then Lee Abrams came in and changed the concept of it.
But ABX started to fray a little bit at the seams when W4 started to format up. What happened was that Shelley Grafman, the owner of the facility, who also had KSHE in St. Louis, which was gigantic, and to this day is still gigantic, a gigantic radio station. Shelley Grafman came in, and he was boots on the ground, and he looked at me, and he seemed to think that I was the one sane human left. I mean, that's how I more or less took it. He could kind of tell me what to do and then get the rest to follow me
Right.
as best I could. All he wanted me to do was try. So he wanted me to take this Keishi format and sort of put it in the studio and just ask them to try it.
Yeah.
Maybe we got a little Goldilocks here. Some thought it was too cold. Some thought it was too hot. Some thought it was just right. Well, Shelley thought it was just right. Shelley, though, was a rocker. He wore blue jeans. He wore a big Keishi belt buckle. He wore a stupid baseball cap. He had a toupee of long hair. He's a wild dude, man. Anyway.
So you were at ABX for 3 years, but then you left radio to take a job with record company.
CBS.
How did this present itself?
Well, let me just do one thing real quickly. While I was at ABX, the day came when he fired, Shelley Grafman told me to fire Steve Dahl.
Oh, my.
Steve Dahl and I were best friends. Steve Dahl and I were at one point, I mean, we did everything together. He and another guy that came to ABX, which nobody got, went on to be a commentator for NBC Sports, Joel Myers.
Yeah.
And Joel Myers was big and is still the voice of the Los Angeles Lakers.
He's got a huge voice.
Oh, my God. And so it's an important part of my career was just that. So I've got to tell you that at one point, Grafman told me, go in there and fire Steve Dahl. Because he was eating his cereal on the radio. See, morning at that time, morning was all nights.
Right.
People weren't getting into music until about 10 a.m. in the morning. So if you did the morning show, you were hogtied. Nobody cared.
Right.
There was no reason for you to do sports, weather, traffic, unless you did it on your own to sort of like see if you could compete. Well, Dahl came in from California, hired by Shelley Grafman, and Dahl started, and what he did in California, in Sacramento, was he ate cereal and he became the guy who was always eating food on the air. So he did that. He'd do cereal, and he did a couple of other things that people were really starting to like. He really was moving the meter in the morning.
Right.
And so by the time Shelley Grafman had it with him, the listeners had not. The listeners were starting to really embrace this guy. So Shelley said, go in the room and fire this guy. I can't stand it anymore. All he talks about is eating a cereal and wanting to sleep with Linda Ronstadt. He did not say it like that, by the way.
No.
And he did. He always said Linda Ronstadt. And it's kingdom to just be with Linda Ronstadt for a night in the Cub Scout uniform. You know what I mean? And I knew that Dahl was, I mean, I'm serious now. I knew that Dahl was going to be big. And I said, I think you're making a big mistake. And I remember going to W. He said, I'm going to W. Somebody.
I took him for a boat ride. I remember I had that Go Fast boat.
Yeah.
And I grabbed him and took him for a boat ride, and we went out and had a great time. And because I was told, you know him, don't you? And I said, yeah, I know him. And and they said, well, we would love to have him here. And so we went out and we went for a boat ride, and we put the thing together, and I brought him back in, and Walsh hired him, and the next thing was history.
And he was gone. He was gone like that. And I to this day, it's the biggest mistake maybe in the history of Detroit radio. The only other one was made by W4, however, letting Howard Stern go.
Oh, God.
Because Howard Stern was coming on hot and fast.
Oh, God.
Well, if they would have changed formats, they could have kept them maybe.
Well, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Maybe, and I'm sure they would have.
Yeah.
I'm sure they would have, yeah. Yeah, he would have been a chapter in his book, Private Parts, as opposed to just a couple of pages. Mm-hmm. But I remember telling Shelley Grafman, you're making a big mistake. My point is, he put me on in mornings, and all I did was answer the phone and say, he went to W4. He went to excuse me. Yeah, he went to W4. All 6 lines.
He went to W4.
Phones were ringing. What happened to Steve? What happened to the guy that ate the cereal? And we went to W4.
I had gotten when he got there, I had gotten an order from Ross Roy Advertising, which was one of the big advertising agencies, and their offices were across the street.
Yeah.
And it was for DTE Energy or one of those, and there was a woman that did the spot. And he came on the air when the spot would come on, and the spot would finish, and he'd go, I just want to eat cereal off of her belly.
Wow.
And went on. And so they called up, and I had to go over there and defend it and defend Dahl and all that. And that was just one of many things that we had to deal with the advertisers with Dahl.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to go after anything. No, he was a rule breaker, not a rule maker, all the way.
He was Howard Stern and David Letterman before they were doing that kind of shtick.
Yeah, he was kind of inventing it as he goes, but he was a quick learner. He was a really bright guy. Still, I shouldn't say it in the past tense. He's a very, very bright guy.
Very bright guy.
I mean, anybody that can put together the Disco Demolition. And anybody that can get a team to forfeit, you know what I mean?
Well, we won Tigers were awful, and we won a game.
Yeah, we won a doubleheader.
My favorite part of that was because, if you remember, they didn't show both games. So they came on the second game, and to see not Ernie Harwell, but George Kell and Al Kaline befuddled about what was happening.
There was, and I was living in Chicago when that happened. When that's when
you were CBS Records.
Yeah, because
segue into CBS Records.
So you say, how did I end up with CBS? Well, the bottom line was I became there was a fellow by the name of Bob Birch out of St. Louis who became the national PD. And so he ran both St. Louis, which was a no-brainer, and never to this day still is a power number one. And as a matter of fact, he decided he liked it better in St. Louis than he did here. And he also liked the fact that they were looking at property in Los Angeles and San Francisco. So he was the guy that was out looking for properties. I stayed back, and I was the guy that took just the hard part of the gig. Do this, do that. And they were starting to implement a format. The guys were pushing back harder and harder. However, there were people still desperate to get in and get on at WABX. And so I was also dealing with all of the record reps, and I got along with all of the record reps really, really well, including the CBS record folks, which was Epic and Epic's associated labels, and also CBS Columbia Records. So I went to work for Epic Records first, and I left at ABX, and it wasn't that big a deal for them. It was like, oh, okay. And I think I had already hired Costan at that point.
Yeah.
I think I had hired Costan. But long story short again on that, I ended up going to Chicago, where I took on the record industry for 3.5 years, and there was a phone call that came in late 1979 from Jim Johnson. And Calvert, he said, "You're coming home." But I got that whole year, those 3.5 years in radio were really special, super, super special. But anyway, that's it. I mean, they asked me to go, and I thought this is the time to go. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with Columbia Records. I thought I'd go and grow. It was paying decent money. It was a great life. Had just an incredible expense account. I loved it.
Who were some of the artists that you had to kind of...
Who didn't I?
Springsteen.
Yeah, Springsteen. Well, I went on the Columbia side. I had everybody from Lou Rawls to Springsteen, Billy Joel. We actually had the Rolling Stones for one album. We certainly had... we had everybody. I mean, literally, the question would... I remember being out on the road with Bruce. I remember being out on the road with Aerosmith. I remember being out on the road. Aerosmith was great. I've got a great thank you letter on my wall thanking me for the tour that summer. Got a great thank you note from Bruce thanking me for the Darkness on the Edge of Town tour. I guess, who else? We had so many. I really wish, if anybody wants to Google, if you Googled names on Columbia Records,
oh, man,
it'd be off the charts. There's Columbia or whatever it is now.
That wraps up part one of my interview with Mr. Ken Calvert. Today's show has been brought to you by the Linda Rea Team, NRM Screamcast, and of course Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio, the docuseries. Don't make sure you tune in next Friday for part 2 of my interview with Ken Calvert. Until then,
you can't go. All the plants are gonna die.